Hey, family. Dr. Rebecca Schwarzlose is a cognitive neuroscientist, and she's done some incredible work in this field. She works primarily with children, and her new book, Brainscapes, is one that you've really got to get. Right now, join me in an incredible conversation with her about this particular area of science and how it can impact our lives, not just how it has done it. Welcome, Dr. Becca. Rebecca, so your book, wow. Are you excited about this? I mean, what was your journey into authorship? Brainscapes, whoa.
Well, thank you. It was a long journey. I think this book, probably from beginning to end, it took me about 10 years to conceptualize and create. But it really was. I felt like it was a story that needed to be told and that hadn't really been told to the general audience, to a general group of people. And so it was something that, in neuroscience, we know about many of these ideas, some of them for a very long time. But they really are powerful ideas for all of us to understand in terms of understanding ourselves and our and other aspects of our society.
There couldn't be a better time for your book to be out, okay? We've all come through so much that people haven't understood, people have resented, just every emotion you can imagine. And I'm sure you're going to tie us into how neurologically that is happening for people and how they can get to the place they need to be at some point in this conversation. But I'm really interested to find out, what about your growing up led you here? I mean, what type of little girl were you to become such an incredible scientist?
Oh, well, thank you so much. I was a very inquisitive child. I was an avid reader and, pretty nerdy. I think I had my collection of cicada husks in my room that I would look at and, weird, curiosities. So I just always was.
Listen now, we are across the globe. You've got to share cicada husks with people so they know what you're talking about.
Yeah. Well, it's just a large insect, and it sheds its husk every once in a while. So little things like that I would find features of nature that I kind of found fascinating. So I guess I was sort of inclined in that direction very early on, but I was really interested, particularly in the mind and brain. Both, it's all of us have the pleasure of getting to think about the mind and brain from our own first person vantage point. But I was also very interested, having kind of life experience, kind of with kind of the way that mental illness can interrupt and interfere with kind of how the brain works, and sort of seeing in loved ones and friends that this is, this brain that we have is a physical thing that we live in and we have our world in, but we also, it can be affected by something as simple as a pill, and it can kind of change how we think and feel. And that was such a fascinating thing for me, thinking about growing up. How does this funny little organ work?
Yeah, because most kids aren't even thinking about brain. I mean, brain comes into conversation in a classroom, or they hear it used idiomatically, but not in any detail. There are two questions I got to jump into with you. And the first one, Rebecca, is more about when we hear a lot today around mental illness and mental wellness, emotional illness and emotional wellness, which can be very different. I've seen people considered mentally ill be quite emotionally happy within themselves. And I've seen that recently, as a matter of fact, quite dramatically. So that first question is there a space between wellness and illness that I'm not talking about a movement back and forth, but is there a space between that is studied or a part of how we need to learn and think about who we are and who others are? And then that second question that may tie in a little bit to it is, you said that your brain is a collection of maps and that's not a metaphor. I've heard throughout my early adult life of the a map. You say it's a collection of maps. So my brain went, okay. I think of a map and I think of many cities, towns, rivers, mountains, geo spaces. And now I'm hearing maybe it's a collection of maps. It's not just the map of Tarboro inside the map of North Carolina, inside the map of the USA, inside the map of the world. It's lots of maps. That's how I interpret it. So do I need help?
No, I'll explain that. That's a very common confusion because of the terms that we use. Maybe I'll start with the first one, which was a very big question, which we could probably spend the whole time talking about. I think we are still we're still figuring out how to think about mental illness in relation to, the variety of human kind of thought and emotion and tendencies that exist in our general population. And so kind of one thing that, there are kind of two things to think about. One, there's many things, but two things that I kind of juxtapose. One is that there's no question, mental illness, when you get to the point of sort of severe illness, can be so incapacitating and debilitating. It can be such a challenge for people, and it can be life-threatening in many cases. So it is, such a serious public health concern that people who have mental illness and are struggling with it need a lot more support than our society gives them. We really don't have parity for mental health. We don't help people with a acute mental challenge the way that we help people who are having a heart attack or having a physical ailment that we can kind of pinpoint in a more direct way. And so unfortunately that means that people go without help in our society, and that's to the detriment of all of us. But also, I think it's important to think about the fact that mental illness, as we kind of typically define it, is really part of a spectrum of our whole population. That we all have different tendencies, and that in fact, some of the tendencies, which in kind of an extreme form or when we're under stress or in an environment that is not supporting us, those tendencies could become an illness.
Is depression mental illness?
Yeah, so depression,
or
depression,
is depression, depending on where it is, just a part of mental wellness that needs, it can go a lot of ways, right? Or it can go high or low, I should say.
Yeah, so we have tendencies. So we might have somebody with kind of who is not does not have major depression, but has a tendency toward depression or depressive thought, or some kind of thought patterns or some sort of emotional responses that are in that vein. And they may be, at higher risk than if we put them in a situation where they are, under a great deal of stress or something else happens. So there can be tendencies that can be more mild that can then get exacerbated and become illness. And then, for something like depression, we can also kind of move out of that period of acute illness and get better and no longer be acutely depressed, but still have those tendencies that are kind of part of our temperament or our character. And some of those tendencies themselves, there's more evidence, needn't be thought of as harmful or bad in and of themselves. That in some environments and circumstances, some of these tendencies like anxiety or depression could be reflecting when they are non-acute. And not severe, they can actually be to some degree adaptive and help us to, for example, if you're not anxious enough in dangerous situations, you could have a terrible accident. So yeah. Anxiety is beneficial, and with depression too, being able to see the world not through rose tinted glasses, being able to see things in a kind of more clear-eyed perspective, which could come, we don't know, but could come with a kind of having that tendency.
So if the brain is a collection of maps, and I'm still getting my brain wrapped around that, mm-hmm. I thought when I think of a collection of maps in here, I think perhaps that is an indication of schizophrenia, or is schizophrenia when you have multiple personalities or such. I thought everybody had one map with a lot of roads on it. So you just completely reframed my thinking. We look at, though, how you have intersected or shared real life stories with the research you've done and are bringing this information forward. Did you ever wonder, or did you ever search slash find that there's an opportunity to remap? And would that be a good or a bad thing? I mean, if people are mentally ill, does remapping tinker with the naturalness of who they are? Is it a journey they take, building it through experience and conversation and rethinking? Or is it something that, like with the heart, we can go in and do a physical surgery that alters and creates a better wellness for someone?
So
That's a scary question.
It is. It's a big question. Let me just rewind a little bit.
Said big. I said scary.
Okay. Scary and big. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, so let me, it's challenging because there are a lot of sort of different conceptualizations out in the general public about mental illness and what it is, and also about the brain. And there's a lot of conceptualizations in the scientific community, and we certainly don't have it figured out at all.
And about what wellness looks like. What does wellness look like? Who decides what wellness is?
Yes. Well, and I think that is so I want to talk about that, but first I just wanted to backtrack. So a couple things. One is that so schizophrenia is a form of psychosis. It's not actually. It's commonly, people often talk about it being kind of a version of multiple personality disorder, but it's actually very different than that. Doesn't relate to multiple personalities, but has more to do with kind of different ways in which there's sort of a disconnection between kind of one's internal state and reality that can be reflected in things like hallucinations, hearing voices, kind of having delusional thoughts. So that is kind of good to just make sure that everybody knows. And then in terms of the map, so you had asked me about is the brain one big map or many maps? And the way I kind of talk about it in my book is, when we often talk about mapping the brain as scientists, and what we really mean by that is we're trying to figure out what all the parts do. And it's sort of like if someone gave us a car. Oh, I'm so sorry. It's like if somebody gave us a car. Too many gestures. If someone handed us.
Oh, no, it's great.
So if someone handed us a car, just put a car in front of us, and we didn't know how it worked, and we wanted to figure it out, we'd start taking the pieces apart, and we'd say, well, this piece came from here. What does it do to make the car run? This piece comes from here. So in a way, what we're really doing is kind of generating an inventory of locations and functions. And so that's the kind of mapping that you often hear about when you hear about how scientists are mapping the brain and understanding its layout.
Right.
And so what I'm referring to in the book are that if you take one of these areas, these like pieces of the brain that we have kind of tried to identify and say this bit of brain seems to do X, or X and Y and Z more is probably more accurate because each brain bit is doing multiple things. If you were to zoom in on that brain bit, and when you look really closely and you can listen to what the cells are doing in that brain bit, many of these brain areas actually form literal maps of our experience. So maps of what we're seeing that are mapped out according to the locations of our visual field. So where things are happening relative to our gaze. Maps of our body surfaces that allow us to feel touch or feel pain and know where on our body those things are happening. And maps of hearing. I mean, many maps of the spaces around us. And so these are all little maps that are kind of fitted within that bigger inventory that we talked about. And so that's the explanation there for how you can have multiple maps. And then, one thing I want to kind of make sure, when we think about mental illness, it's kind of one of our primary things that we want to understand about the brain. And unfortunately, it's also one of the toughest nuts to crack. in neuroscience and clinical psychology kind of are grappling with the fact that we can find differences on average between a brain of somebody who is diagnosed with a particular mental disorder and brain of somebody who's not, or groups of people who are and are not. But that information hasn't so far really translated for us being able to say, this is why mental illness happens, this is where it happens, and, be able to then say, if we make this change, we can change it, we can undo it, or in some way remap it the way you were referring to. And so,
So
yes.
many of us grew up thinking that the brain instructs the body. As I listen to you, actually it's a cooperative where the body's instructing the brain as well. What first got you interested in neuroscience?
I think it's kind of, to me, it feels like the ultimate riddle. I mean, it's the ultimate question. We have this subjective conscious experience of our world. We feel things, we taste things, we hear things, we wonder things, and that seems very ethereal. And yet it's all created by this little organ that's smaller than a soccer ball. I mean, it's really, our brains are not that impressive in size, or, they're just an organ, but they do so much. And we really are at just the beginning of understanding how they do this. And the questions of how they do it are so important for understanding why our experience is the way it is. And so the book and the maps that I talk about, they're really like the kind of just the first step, the foundations of understanding and tackling those questions. These maps were discovered. The first map to be discovered was discovered in the 1800s, and they have been discovering more and more since then. And so they're
wait a minute. So in the 1800s, we're thinking people were still at a highest level using microscopes. Okay. Now you have so much digitally enhanced ability to look, see. You're saying they knew it back then.
Yeah. Well, and that really illustrates the foundations of neuroscience and psychology. A lot of it came from observing things in patients and being kind of like Sherlock Holmes and deducing things that you couldn't physically see in the brain, but that you could make observations and start to draw tentative conclusions. And so, the first map, was kind of jointly observed in humans by a neurologist who was watching how people who had certain kind of seizures, how the seizures would travel through their body, and use that information to actually just kind of surmise and deduce.
That was in the 1800s or before that?
That was in the 1800s, yes.
Okay,
yes.
All right.
So
they were able to look at this patient and then got the idea that they could map about the brain.
Yeah, so he was observing, he would see that people were getting, people might have like a head wound or something in a certain part of their head, and then they would start having seizures. So that can happen if you have a head trauma. And he was observing that across patients, their seizures would start in different parts of their body, but the seizures would always start by traveling along kind of a certain path. So if it started in your hand, it would never travel from this hand to this hand. It would always travel, from your hand to your arm, or your hand to your face, actually. So there are specific ways in which it would travel, and other ways it would never travel as it started to spread. And based on that information, those kind of observations, both about where the trauma was in the brain and how the convulsions, the seizures traveled, he started piecing together what the human brain map for movement looked like, which is, I think, pure Sherlock Holmes. It's really pretty fascinating. And then other scientists around the same time started to use like little electrodes to test the maps in animals and be able to show that animals also had body movement maps that were laid out according to their bodies.
Well, what about you? Did you have any favorite moments or aha moments about the brain during your studies and research?
Oh man, that's a great question, because I feel like, the great thing about science is that maybe once a week you have an aha moment where you especially with the brain, there's just so many levels and there's so many exciting ways that what, we're learning and studying in this organ relates to our lives. So I'm actually having trouble, picking up on one particular aha moment. But I do think that, when I was doing research, when I was in graduate school, my research was in visual perception, and I was studying kind of object recognition and how we recognize, for example, faces and bodies, and how that is carried out in the brain. And
isn't there a movie star, Rebecca? Isn't there a movie star who recently, like within the last couple of months, we learned they're having trouble distinguishing people by face, and it's happened in their, I think they're in their 40s, and it's happening for them, and so they've had to remove themselves from their career because of that, to some degree.
I haven't heard about that. I don't always know the kind of latest what's going on.
Yeah, they specifically said they have trouble with facial recognition. And I thought, I'm going to be talking with Rebecca. I'm curious about this. And then you mentioned it.
Yes, yeah. So this is a condition that's actually quite widespread. And in the book I talk about, there's actually face recognition, even just, across the population, there's quite a wide range of kind of abilities that it's really, even though we think of it as something universal that everybody can do, that's not the case. That for a lot of people, they may be, and we're still figuring out exactly why, they really from birth kind of have just not been very good at, or in some cases have really been just incapable of recognizing the faces of others. And there kind of are multiple, and this can also happen later in life if you have damage to certain parts of your brain that help you to recognize faces. So that was actually how we kind of first began to learn about these areas. Is, again, brain damage would lead to somebody who could no longer recognize their spouse's face,
Rebecca,
and that was a clue. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so there's so many questions to ask you. I agree with you. Each of these could just be a whole conversation in itself, and maybe we should consider that. Right now, though, there's so many people who are questioning themselves in ways they didn't before we all went home just over 2 years ago to figure out how and if we would live through COVID. When we think about it, let me use something that's very common to all of us, okay? And then something very that I care a lot about. Now, the thing that's common to all of us is that we've all learned that dyslexia is a thing. Is dyslexia an illness, or is it a condition? We also, and this one I care deeply about, autism. And I do a lot of work and care and promotion of Howroyd, because they're doing incredible work to help people live well with autism, live their best lives, I should say, with autism. You probably, and scientists like you, are doing research to actually discover more about it. So what's the difference between a condition and an illness? Do they overlap? And where do dyslexia and autism fit when we think about that, especially in an enlightened age of DEI, diversity and inclusion? How do we look at it?
Yeah, I think that is a fantastic question. It's something that I've been thinking a lot about, that, and I think that also people in the field are thinking about, because it's, it's challenging, because we had sort of psychiatry in particular had to sort of develop, over time has developed diagnoses sort of, and there are lots of reasons to have diagnoses, and diagnoses have a lot of benefits. That if you can say this is the pattern that I'm seeing in this patient, then a clinician can say, oh, in other patients with this pattern, this is what has been able to help them the most. And so that there's a benefit to that, but also to some degree, what we see is that there's a lot of, even within putting people in the same box, right, in the same in the same diagnosis, we find that there's often quite a bit of variability, the differences, so that you've put them in the same box, but they're actually different manifestations of what we're calling the same condition or the same illness, are very different. And on top of that, there are kind of, especially an in-between for what you were describing with dyslexia and autism, and also ADHD and some other kind of conditions that sort of often begin very early in life, and you know, are kind of just reflecting a different way of the brain working, that there are differences there, but this is also not in it can that those differences can create challenges, but they are not a lesser kind of way of the brain to work. They are a different way for the brain to work, right? And so what I think we have to also think about is when we talk about conditions that are, you know, like not neurotypical. So there's a kind of a language of saying, is something neurotypical or is it neurodivergent, or it's kind of just different than what we consider typical. And so I think there's a movement to sort of change how we talk about conditions and realize that, you know, that somebody who kind of is neurodivergent, it doesn't mean that their brain is not working as, you know, it's not like it's broken or it's not working as well. It works differently. And that leads to different strengths and different challenges. And, you know, and what we want to do then is really kind of try to understand those differences, but that we should make sure to understand them not in a way that stigmatizes and says, you know, you're sick because you're different, or, you know, and we want to fix necessarily, you know, we want to fix you because you're different. What's important is to say, you know, how do we understand the differences in ways that can help, you know, people with the specific challenges that they face. And I think that's a really important direction that we need to move in.
In many instances, doing that, as I've seen again through some of the work and some of the results that have been achieved through Howroyd organization, the foundation, we actually all win better. It's not just about us being thought and inclusive human beings. It's about how we're winning from when we learn to see differences as opportunities. And, you know, Rebecca, in a New York Times review of your book, Brainscapes, it was written, and I'm going to quote it, in an exquisite choreography orchestrated by genes and the environment, our billions of brain cells create all kinds of special representations. What you ultimately see is warped by your brain maps. Break that down for our family listening right now so they can understand what that means in a simplified way and really leave our discussion with a better opportunity to think about themselves as well as others.
Sure. So when we perceive the world around us, it's easy to think that that's the world that exists, that's kind of what's out there, and we're getting all the information that's out there as it is out there. But the truth is that actually what we get is a sliver of the information in our environment. And so the brain maps, when scientists studied the brain maps and were able to look at them up close and learn about their organization, we learned that these maps are warped in ways that actually help us to survive. And so a great example of what I mean by warped is I had talked earlier about a visual map that represents in the physical tissues of our brain, across the surfaces of our brain, physically the activity of the cells. So the electrical activity of cells corresponds to where light is striking our retina, which corresponds to where things are in space. And so there's a map, you know, in our brain representing basically the visual information coming in, but it's warped so that the part that's representing where we're pointing our eyes is just, you know, it's like 100 times more represented. I mean, literally 100 times kind of better, higher fidelity representation than the representation of what's coming in the corner of our eyes. And if you think about it, you know, even though we never really notice it, of course, the vision in the corner of your eyes is terrible, which is why, you know, we move our eyes constantly to see well. And so what we have done.
I grew up, hey, Rebecca, where I grew up and where I still live in many, they say people give you the side eye, you know, like they can see out of that space that you're describing really gets warped, and they got that clear vision there. So I think I think it's incredible where you're going with this, and I'm wondering if what you're talking about now is leaning in on where you wrote about the brain evolving, and as it evolves, the brain maps get distorted to save energy and space. Is that kind of tied to this same conversation?
Yes. So I go into the book why we have maps, and it winds up the short answer is that it saves energy and space for our brain. So it allows us to represent more information in a more space efficient manner. So we don't have heads that are the size of beach balls, which would be very unfortunate for us. But the warping also is helping us with that. And so what it does is, if we have this much chunk of brain that we can dedicate to this visual map, for example, we could just dedicate everything, equally to the visual space, but then we kind of have crummy vision everywhere. And so by doing this is this great trade-off where by kind of warping and blowing up our kind of ability to perceive the visual center of gaze at very high resolution, and then the periphery at kind of poor resolution, we get this ability to have a sweet spot where we can get really clear, really crisp vision, and then still have a kind of enough in the side periphery to be able to detect if someone's sneaking up on us, or something, there's movement that there's a panther coming. So it's like this great trade-off where we can see a lot not very well, and then see a little very well, and then move our eyes so that we get to see things very well when needed. It's a great trade-off, so you can make more of that little chunk of brain.
Something. Something I found really interesting. We're going to talk all over each other like we're on that show called The View. There's something though that was really interesting in a Bloomberg interview, and it was around how we think about time. Now, you used a quote about how the map is not the territory, and described how we use our brain maps for space, but we don't have maps for time. I don't know if I'm getting it right or not, but can you go deeper on how our brains perceive and process time? Over the last couple of years, with people living through COVID and some not, we've all witnessed different relationships to time. We can't believe it's been 2 years. Oh my God, I didn't think ever end. Wow. You mean we went from research to vaccinations? Wow. I lived through it, and we just got all these relationships that we attach to time. Okay. We even pay for based on time. We look at a skill set, but then when we start to pay, we think about time. And so can you talk about it a little bit and go deeper on how our brains perceive and process time, given that most poets write or acknowledge we've only got so much time here?
Yes. So I should always be careful to say there's no brain maps for time, because we don't know all about every piece of brain. So, with that caveat, we haven't found maps for time, but of course, our brain can process and represent time. So how does it do that? Well, so there's some evidence that one of the things that we do is that we take our maps for space, for example, and we take our kind of aptitude. We're very good with space and location, and our brains really are. Those maps are primarily made to reflect those strengths. But we can, so a lot of times what we do is we use space to think about time, and we do this in a couple of different ways. I mean, one way is just, for example, I walked from my house to Jimmy's house. And so I think that it's probably been about 10 minutes since I left the house because I went this far, right? So there are ways we can kind of figure out time based on space. Or I wrote 2 pages on my manuscript, so I figure I probably had not a half hour, but 2 hours or something. But then we also use analogies. And so one way, for example, that we do that is, when we're reasoning about time in kind of a more flexible fashion, like what happened first? Was it, which happened first, the Revolutionary War or the Civil War, for example? We're thinking about like things relative to each other in time, and we tend to do that spatially. So, and how we do that spatially, how we kind of mentally represent events in time spatially, depends on our culture and actually how we learned in school to read and to have sort of timelines in our classrooms. So that, in cultures like, ours, where, you're reading English and you're going from left to right when you read, and the timelines go from left to right, we tend to think of things from the past as happening on the left of us, and things that are further forward in time going to the right. And it's really arbitrary. Other cultures that read, in the opposite direction do the opposite. But the idea is that we just kind of have this way of switching time to space to think about it more flexibly. And we then can use our spatial brain maps to help us do that. And then there are other parts of the brain, like the hippocampus, which is a very a kind of amazing brain area that's kind of tucked deeper within the brain, that that doesn't seem to have maps in the same way that the maps I described. So there are parts of the brain that don't really operate through maps. They actually have a kind of a very different sort of way of representing information, and they're better at learning, sort of being able to sort of represent very new things. And so actually that area of the brain is also important for processing time and for memory.
You talk about processing time and memory and representing an opportunity for new things. A lot of your work focuses more on children and development. And since that's the case, how do you think the situations around COVID and the lockdowns of the past few years have had an impact on children versus adults? I was speaking with a friend in North Carolina, and he mentioned to me, he said, JBH, my baby does not know a time not living in COVID. Now, why that was important to him, I think, is because he was coming from a space of him growing up not in COVID. But he started to wonder what that would mean long term for her. And he has two other children who did know playground and classroom before COVID and got pulled from it. Are there any long-term implications that we might learn from during this period that would support cognitive perspectives?
That's a wonderful question. And, I wish we knew more. I think we're going to learn a lot more, for better or worse, in the coming
We
years.
need the time to study.
Yes. But, I think that the disruption that COVID presented in basically, all aspects of our lives really has laid bare that there are a lot of questions we really don't yet have answers to, in terms of what are the key experiences in childhood that help children to kind of formulate and develop the maps that will allow them to do what they need to do later in life. And how much is enough. So for example, we do know that babies and children need to see faces in order to develop these areas, these face recognition areas I mentioned. But if is it enough to see just their parents' faces? It may be. We don't know. But is and to what degree is seeing fewer, seeing facial expression just in the eyes versus the mouth? How does that change? Is less interaction with people? What are the impacts? And I think either way, we kind of had to take we'll have to continue to take, if needed, steps to make sure that we're prioritizing health and safety of our population. So things like masking and social distancing when needed in the past, and hopefully not too much in the future, but if necessary, we can do that. But it is true that I think that we still have more to understand about what are the basic inputs to child experience, and how do those kind of impacts what are the downstream effects of the changes to those experiences later in life? And we're really in the process of learning and trying to adjust to what we do learn about that. But we do know that early age is very important for brain development and for also socio-emotional development. And so one thing that is crystal clear already is that children, and adults, but I think particularly children have kind of there's a mental health crisis out there. So COVID, we already know, has had an impact on children's development in ways that are, at least in children's sort of ability,
But
to
Rebecca,
cope.
have we always been a village? It takes a village to raise a child. Have we always been a village?
Yeah, I mean,
Is it adult response to COVID that's impacting children, or is COVID an unnatural state for the response we had to COVID? Is that just an unnatural state for us? Because we've been focusing mostly on human brains, and everybody's got to get brain state. It's just incredible. But do we need the village? I mean, I know we need male and female to come together to create a human being. We need certain qualities of that, from a gender perspective, not from a gender perspective, but from a cellular perspective. How are we thinking about this? Are we training for crisis or mental illness based on societal things we set up, or is there a science thing in it? I guess is the question.
yeah. So
I don't know if that's one you can answer.
I think here's what I think I can say, which is that I think that you're setting up a really important distinction, which is that there's a question about what are the sort of the inputs in development that what are the impacts of developmental impacts, and that's a scientific question. And then there's kind of a secondary kind of laden stigmatizing question about what is a better childhood, or is there a way that you should be raised that would be ideal? And I think it's, first of all, it's essential to say off the bat that no, there is no one way of raising children, and there isn't one single ideal for how the kind of loved, as long as a child has love and support and security, that can come from any different sources. And but we do want to make sure that we do give children the security and the opportunity for kind of attachment, and so allowing children to be living in poverty, in extreme poverty and stress, and allowing families to be in extreme poverty and stress, that is going to place added burdens on the family and on the child. But that doesn't,
in societies where that is out of the norm. I think, yeah.
Yeah, I see. Yes, I see what you're saying. So a lot of stress can be also kind of relative poverty. So that you're saying, if you're in an environment where the whole community, this is the lifestyle, and it's a different kind of there's a different standard for, and you also a different standard for kind of shared resources, or for sort of family living,
or going back to where the scientists who you referenced early in our conversation discovered some ideas around mapping in the 1800s. What was normal then would be poverty now, and so that timing thing as well, which really underneath my question, moving away from societal and going back to just the science of it. How does a person develop a personality? I mean, is there a formula to it, or is it a combination of nature and nurture? How does a person develop a personality?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, and I don't have an answer for you on that. I don't know. I mean, I think that's something we're still trying to figure out, and certainly there is a lot of work trying to understand what are the early building blocks of temperament, and are there certain particular neural processes that predispose a newborn baby to be more anxious or kind of more, adventurous, or all the other kind of ways in which we know that, any parent or adult has seen babies have their own kind of personality to some degree. There's some of that already when they're born. So that's a great question, and I don't have an answer for it, but I know that there's exciting work going on, trying to answer it. And I also want to get back to the last question to add. I think that what you're also highlighting, which is important, is that culture is an important part of development and of the human condition, and it's something that we often ignore in neuroscience. And so first of all, we tend not to study, different cultures with different lifestyles very much. We sort of assume they're all like our culture and lifestyle. And we tend to kind of, it's very easy there is certainly a history in neuroscience of kind of coming with a mindset that there is one ideal way of growing up, one ideal kind of brain way of being. And that's something that I absolutely think we need to move away from. I don't think it's beneficial for our science or for kind of how we then think about and talk about our findings.
That provokes another question for me, and that is, and this is going back to children and the brain development. Are there ways that brain mapping can be useful, Rebecca, in informing how we educate children?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that, I think an awareness of how, for example, we are quite literally taking things like our timelines and our kind of spatial maps and using them to represent more kind of ethereal or less concrete things like time, is can be helpful. I think that can be helpful for helping teachers understand why other techniques might work. I think that there's such a great education literature out there already showing that, for example, people might learn well in different ways, and sometimes taking something abstract and drawing a picture of it, putting it in some physical spatial form is very helpful for us to understand it, so that the educational findings are there. But I think it can take you another step to just understand why that is. Why should we, why would a picture tell 1,000 words sometimes in these instances? And so I think that's kind of the benefit there.
I remember when my son and my daughter were toddlers in toddler school, and I was very involved with the teachers and with the curriculum and the environment. The school embraced that. And I remember teacher, Miss Andrea, said, I've discovered that Brett really engages a lot of his senses during his learning, and he can learn in different environments. He can be an audio learner, he can be a visual learner. And she was saying the distinction between how kids learn was so important. And you take me back to that with your conversation. Rebecca, mapping the brain does have some clear implications in the medical field, though. And I don't know what your thoughts are on the technology side. I'd love to know them. We all know that people like Elon Musk see the potential for things like Neuralink, where they're hoping to link brains and computers together someday. What are your thoughts on this? Good, bad, possible, inevitable?
Complicated. I would say,
Scary to take a position on. Don't want it canceled.
No, I'm happy. I'm happy though to share my thoughts on it, but to saying that it's complicated in that it's not all good or all bad. I think that the neural kind of the developing neural technology, and certainly the sort of brain computer interfaces that will kind of the idea that we'll someday be reading our minds, or we could be sharing our thoughts through the internet, through our head devices. So those things may still happen, but we're not there. We're not there yet. But there are technologies that are finding, at least in the short term, that they can help people with who are kind of paralyzed, and give them some ability to, for example, control a cursor on a computer screen or a robotic arm, and give them some some agency or in their world that they didn't have otherwise because of their kind of injury. And so that, I think that illustrates the potential benefit of technologies that try to bridge that divide between brains and computers and allow us to kind of, but at the same time, I do have major privacy concerns. Yes. So I feel like, what I think we should be doing right now is, I mean, I don't think we're not on the cusp of having an implant that's, but I do think that there are ways in which, less direct interfaces could cull information, neural information that is less detailed, but still combined with other information about ourselves, could be a privacy issue. And certainly we already have privacy issues because, there are some very large companies that we, operate with, like Facebook or Google, that we wind up spending a lot of our time interacting with in one form or another. And they, they are collecting information about us, and so we have to think very carefully, I think, at this stage about sort of what are the lines that we want to draw in the sand about, what kind of is and is not an okay use of information from that might be collected from our brain, say in like even a headband or a hat, and who are we okay with having it, and what rights do we have? We have rights to privacy for our health information. So like, how would we count something like kind of data collected from our brains? We should be laying this out, and we should be clarifying this now, because there's a lot of investment going on to try to move those technologies forward. And we want to have our rights known and articulated and established before we get to that stage.
Well, what are the potential breakthroughs in neuroscience that you're the most excited about or even hoping for?
That's a great question. So my work is focused on sensory overresponsivity. We were talking about autism earlier, and so how, many neurodevelopmental disorders have people who experience these conditions have kind of sensitive differences with sensory response. So things that might feel, not upsetting or not overwhelming for one person, but the same sound or same sensory touch sensation would be overwhelming and very upsetting and create anxiety and create distress. So, one thing that I've been trying to do is to try to understand kind of what the basis is for those differences, hoping that it can kind of inform us. In terms of, so I think one of the things that we are struggling with in neuroscience is sometimes we run studies where we try to answer a really big question. We have a whole lot of data, but sometimes I think, as a result, we kind of don't get a fine-grained enough measure to be able to answer the specific questions. And we kind of don't necessarily do any of it very well if we have too much general data and then try to answer our specific questions. So I am hopeful. I think it'd be really exciting to see more crosstalk between the tremendous amount of research that's happening in neuroscience that's being carried out with animals, where you can kind of have a better sense of the fine-grained information processing that's happening in their brains, or you can scan them just like you can put a human in a scanner, and we could compare, for example, what, when you do a brain scan for a monkey and you do a brain scan for a human, and how are those similar and different. And so being able to try to translate between the literatures that we have, the data we have from humans, with kind of the limited techniques that we can do with humans, and then just decades and decades of research that has been learned from work with animals and sea slugs and all kinds of little creatures. So I think that could really be transformative, and I hope there'll be more crosstalk.
Well, I am just so not simply amazed, but also appreciative of what you know and how you understand the brain so well. Are there any ways that you've been able to improve your own cognition because of your understanding? I mean, do you have any hacks or tricks or, puzzles or anything that help you to improve your brain function in any way?
Oh boy, I wish I did. I think coffee would be probably my best answer. I mean, I have young children too, so I think, I feel as if just the hack is just to, for me, is just to be as efficient as I can with the time that I have, and to forgive myself when, the kids get sick and things don't get done.
Yes, yes, yes. We've been having lots of discussions, especially in a lot of women's leadership groups, but in most of our executive conversations and management leadership sessions around forgiving yourself and taking care of yourself mentally, physically, and spiritually. Listen, we're going to play 4 for 4 before we get out of here. I'm going to ask you 4 questions to which you'll give me 4 answers. And there are no right or wrong answers. It just helps us to learn from you, get to know you, and appreciate perchance ourselves a little bit better as we hear how you are doing this. So the first of the 4, Rebecca, is you get to invite 4 people to dinner from any time. They can be, as they can already have transitioned, or they can be alive now. Not the future people, but those who are alive now or those who transitioned. They can be from history who you've heard about. But who's going to be at your table?
Oh, boy, I should be ready for this, but I am. I would say I would. Oh boy, can we come back to this one?
We sure can, because you got to tell us why they're there as well.
Oh, okay.
So we'll move to the second one and come back to the first one. What are the 4 different pieces of music you're listening to right now, especially if there's any you share with my family? Our family is across the globe listening to you right now. So what are the 4 pieces of music you're listening to, or authors, and why? Artists.
Boy. Okay. So I have been going with my daughter. My daughter is reaching teenagerhood, and so she has been introducing me to kind of, she's both been discovering some of the artists that she connects to as a teenage girl. And some of them I knew and some of them I didn't. So that's been kind of fun. So we've been learning. I learned about. Oh my goodness, I am having trouble with her name right now. I do not.
Grab your phone. Grab your
Yeah.
phone.
Yes.
If it's on your playlist, what's on your playlist?
Yes. Yeah. All right. Give me a second here. I have a terrible time. Billie Eilish. There. I have a terrible time placing names.
People are laughing right now, going, "She had to think of Billie Eilish."
I know. It's funny. This is the way, and this is another thing. Being forgiving that brains work differently. So for me, I can know. This happens to me with people I see. Like I know all these things about them, but like I either can't remember the name or can't get it to come up quickly.
Right.
So
right.
So this is my thing, and
so
I'm like,
Billy is one, and it's probably at the top of a lot of people's list. You got 3 more.
I know.
Well, you got your phone, huh?
Okay. So I learned about Halsey.
Okay.
I'm sure everybody's laughing at me. It's I don't know. I think I spent too much time reading books and in the recent years and raising kids and didn't hear any cool artists. I learned about let's see, what is Olivia Rodrigo. And then my daughter's also been listening a lot to Katy Perry, I knew Katy Perry, but just, it's hearing the artist that she is kind of connecting with right now. And that's been fun.
It's interesting though, because you've been listening together. Do you know several of my guests listen alone? They go straight to what they get to listen to when they are by themselves. I think it's a beautiful thing that you're sharing what you're listening together, you know, two together and with your daughter. That's just lovely. Thank you. That's really beautiful. I'm a little bit emotional about it, actually. That's really beautiful.
Oh. Well,
okay,
I feel,
so what for books? Yep, yep.
For
you
books?
Feel what now?
Oh,
no,
I was
what
just gonna
you
say. Sorry. Oh, I was just gonna say, yeah, I feel like it's a, with teenagers, you don't have that much longer with them, and I just want to share things with her and be part of her world, and so.
I think that's wonderful. I'm sure you're learning a lot as you listen to not just about her, but from the music. Music has been an incredible teacher. And the reason I asked that question is because music has been so instrumental in my life, not just to how I connect with it and how it helps, informs, or allows me to move forward from moment to moment. I grew up listening to Marvin Gaye, What's Going On, and that album still is on my playlist, and I still have the vinyl. I think about Beatles and how they broke down what was still a firm caste system in the UK, so or songs, that are sung in places of worship. So music is very informing, and it can sometimes be a bigger message than the conversation that one might have. So I think it's beautiful that you're sharing that experience with your daughter. What are the 4 books that you're reading that or have read that you would recommend to our family, and why?
Yeah. So
the
I would recommend
of the brain.
No. I will not I will not recommend this the super scientific stuff. But
I've already recommended Brainscapes, so you got to go for four different.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I was gonna say so on the kind of brain and psychology related side. A couple that one that I've actually just recently read is called Neurotribes by Steve Silberman. And speaking of neurodivergent and neurodevelopmental conditions, and then also The Mismeasure of Man by Stephen Jay Gould. So that is a little bit more of like a scholarly kind of, but it really talks about the ways in which, as we were talking about, there's sort of the biases and stigmas of a culture of scientists in a culture, embedded in a culture, were then applied to the ways in which they studied psychology and the brain, and those perpetuated these stigmas and these kind of cultural biases. So I think that's something that every scientist should read. But I think it's a really good, it's good for all of us to be aware that science is embedded in a culture, in its own, in the milieu, and that culture, biases get reflected often in the work.
Incredible. That's 2 books.
So then a couple of other books that I read, a couple of fiction books. So I joined a book group recently, which is, I've never had time to do it since like forever. So let me just look up the author here. So okay. I read Mexican Gothic by Sylvia Moreno Garcia, and that was really interesting. I really liked how
somebody else just mentioned that to me. Someone else in a general conversation mentioned that book to me.
Yeah, it was a really kind of engaging story, but then it was also really steeped in this history of of sort of kind of European colonialism and sort of and it was woven together in a really beautiful way. And then I recently read Born a Crime by Trevor Noah, and I found that very really interesting, and really kind of transports you to a very different kind of society, but also lays bare some of these kind of ways in which we talk about and think about race even today. But it's just so very interesting, thought-provoking.
One of the things that occurred for me as we were having our conversation was around race. And as an African American female of that age, where I grew up in a segregated Southern community and attended segregated schools, there was fear slash, stay away from mindset around when people started to study the brains. In my own home, or talked about it in my own home, it was quite different. It was like once they get in there and they study, they find that race is something we created, that we bought into, but that really doesn't have a place in science, So it's really interesting how, when you talk about in the whole milieu of how we are looking at our existence as human beings, science is perhaps that thread that helps us to exist together. I mean, we're all looking at whether or not we believe or whether or not we will participate in environmental or ESG efforts, and does it offend who we are spiritually, or does it help us embrace where we are physically? It's a big thing. It's a really big thing right now. And I'm excited that, and one of the reasons I'm so excited about you being here is that we're able to see science part of how we live and not apart from how we live. So I'm really grateful for that. And if you're ready to tell us who are the 4 people you would have at dinner, I would love to know that and why.
Okay. All right. So since we were talking about John Hewlings Jackson, he's the neurologist
Yes.
who did, and he seems like I kind of got fascinated with him in writing the book because he was super absent-minded and but brilliant, and I would be interested to meet him and sort of learn more about him, because he seemed he seemed interesting, and I'm not sure that I would like him, and he would certainly be, he would again be embedded in that environment, probably he was, in London, high society, in the 1800s.
And sitting at your table, eating, listening to Billie Eilish.
Yes. Oh, yeah. So I would like to see, what he was like, and whether he, how he thought, and sort of how his society was reflected in his thinking as well. I would love to meet Harriet Tubman. I've been kind of I keep I remember learning more about her too with my children and being so shocked by her complete courage, and I thought, how could anybody be that courageous and strong? And so I would hope to get the life hacks about how to be, your best, most kind of brave and true self from her, and learn about that, where that bravery comes from and how to harness it.
I think, and you would know this perhaps better from a brain perspective, I think a clear vision or passion that has strong challenge to it is a big motivator for a lot of people. I'm not suggesting that's what we need. I'm saying circumstantially, as human beings, that's where we often operate from. We believe, we desire, our vision is so clear on that thing, and everything around us works against it. I think we, whether it's something bigger than chutzpah, I think I think maybe there's something in the brain we can find out from there, or maybe we'll find out how the heart works with the brain. They have to cooperate, I think, in often circumstances. Who else is at dinner? We've got Harriet there.
I think I would like to meet Virginia Woolf. I think.
You go, Rebecca. Okay.
Yeah.
You go, girl. Why is she going to be at that table? Tell us why.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think it's funny, like both Virginia Woolf and Sylvia Plath have this kind of place in my heart as creative souls.
Yeah.
And as people who were kind of struggling, but also finding finding kind of passion and vision and direction within so much pain. And so I think trying to understand that and learn about them would be fascinating as well. Yeah. So
and who's your fourth guest?
Yes. So maybe, I don't know, maybe Abraham Lincoln. I feel like I want to read a biography of him, but I do think what I again, like, he and his family went through a lot of pain and a lot of struggle, and then he trying to like steer the helm of a country at a time when there was so much division, and it would just be fascinating to talk to, how do you navigate that, and how do you what that was like from a first person perspective.
Did you ever read the book Forced to Glory? Forced?
No, but I will happily. Is that your recommendation?
I'm not recommending it. I'm just curious if it informs you or gives you a broader thought on that as well. And so with that, we are going 4 for 4. 4 pieces of advice you can share with our audience, Rebecca, whether it's your own, if it's advice someone has given you, will you share with us who and why? Why you think this advice is important? 4 pieces of advice.
4 pieces of advice other people gave me that I would like to pass on.
Or your own advice.
Okay. All right. Okay. So, I'll start with the one that I already said earlier, which is forgive yourself. Forgive yourself like you would forgive your neighbor, your friend, your loved one. Be kind to yourself as well. I would share, and I think this is something that I know I try to, I work on and try to remember whenever I'm interacting with someone else, is that you never know where they've been, where they're going, what they're going through. And so just, being really open-minded and kind of giving of that fact that, we're all struggling with something, and how can, rather than if something, if there's a disagreement, trying to keep that in mind, or, I just think that, we could do more of giving each other the benefit of the doubt. And so I usually, let's see, I don't like to give advice because I always, this is hard. I would say, remembering that there are many different ways that a mind can work, and that there isn't one better way, and I think, like, for ourselves and for others, being kind of cognizant of that, and that when you encounter someone who's different from you, that's not a bad thing, that's a good thing, and being willing to see, try to see the world through their eyes, and connect with them. So that would be a third thing. And then I guess the fourth thing, these are all things I'm working on as in addition to sharing. Oh, I lost it. Let's see. I think my fourth thing would be to try to live and give generously.
Wow. Rebecca, thank you is appropriate to say. Thank you so very much. I don't know the word to express how much I have enjoyed this conversation with you. I look forward to more conversation with you. from my heart to your home. Thank you. I'm so filled with gratitude for the day. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed this so very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. It was a joy.